All right. Good morning, Per. Everybody, LiveO2 audience. Per's been a LiveO2 user since approximately 2014, rolling up on a decade. And when he called in asking for an upgrade on his product that finally broke after a decade, we said, hey, it'd be a really good idea to have Per share his nearly 9 years worth of experience with our audience. And so the things I've asked Per to focus on are, number one, as a 9-year user, almost every day, what's his experience, help people that are looking at the product, understand what he feels the value has been and what he feels the value would be for somebody that's looking at it, particularly comparing other breathing technologies like hyperbaric or oxygen-only trainers, aka EWOT, and to help people try to understand the relevance of the adaptive contrast feature functionality relative to his personal experience. So take it away, Per.
Good to see you, Mark. So let's talk about how I met you in the first place. So this was 10 years ago. I was medically disabled from a chronic illness, of which the medical community said there is no known treatment. Those are 3 fun words to hear from numerous doctors. So I realized that if I was going to get better, I had to heal myself. So I started researching and educating myself about the human body. And I called you because I had researched hyperbaric, EWOT, oxygen, et cetera, how it affects the human body, how the atmosphere used to be 30% oxygen, now it's 21%. So I'd done all this research on oxygen, and I came across LiveO2. This was very early on. Your cell phone number was on the website, as I recall, and I called you out of the blue, and you answered. So you and I talked. When I got off that call, I booked a trip to Colorado. My plan was to come out for a week and train with you for a week. After a week, I felt so good, I stayed. I ended up staying 3 weeks. So we trained for 3 weeks in Fort Collins. I left. I bought a unit. And then I think about a month later, I bought another unit. So very early on, I ended up buying 2 units. I had one in Massachusetts, and a friend of mine who's a doctor in Florida had the second unit in Florida. So I started 2014, and I basically have been pretty continuous for those 9+ years. I don't know how many thousands of treatments, or at least 1,000. I don't count, but most of the time I've done it probably 3 days a week at least. This past year, I've been doing it 6 days a week.
Wow. Well, as a regular user, 3 to 6 times a week, it's like, so when somebody's looking at the product, they're wondering about, well, how much value will this have for me in my life journey? Is it, a temporary or permanent investment? Let's talk about vocational productivity. How has it affected your ability to make a living and do your job?
So, I had this chronic illness which I wasn't going to get over. So I believe LiveO2 was a key part of my recovery. Part of what I figured out medically was that my test results mirrored somebody who was having chemotherapy. So obviously I was not having chemo. So my body was not being able to produce energy. Krebs cycle, ATP production was not working. So I went to a specialist in Seattle, for an oncologist, who treated me for several months, which made a significant improvement. What came out of that was I had to figure out a way for my body to be able to generate energy better. And as you know, it starts with oxygen. If you don't have oxygen, you can't generate energy. So I was looking at hyperbaric and EWOT, and then, as I said, bought your unit. I have done hyperbaric and EWOT numerous times. So a first contrast I'll make is the problem with hyperbaric is I sleep in them. I mean, I fall asleep. I get in there and 10 minutes later, I'm asleep. So my heart rate in there is 63, 64, right? So I have the least amount of blood flow possible. So though it's increasing the oxygen pressure and I have more dissolved oxygen, I also have the least amount of exercise and the least amount of heart rate. My challenge with EWOT, and anybody who does it and uses your adaptive contrast will very quickly notice this difference, is that when I'm using LiveO2 machine, and I can do 45 seconds exercising at low oxygen, and then I take 3 breaths of high oxygen, it takes me 20 or 30 seconds to wear off that high oxygen. So if just in that example, if I'm breathing only 80% oxygen like EWOT, my body very quickly reaches a saturation point. So you can feel the fact that your body's reached a saturation point and then it levels off and it can't do anything. What I find is powerful, and I believe is the entire science of what you're doing is that there's a contrast between breathing low oxygen, say 14%, and then breathing high oxygen, 80%. So I go hypoxic, being I'm depleted of oxygen. My body responds because it says, now I want the most amount of oxygen possible. And when I'm in that physiological state, you switch to 80% oxygen.
If I can, I'd like to insert something for the audience. So, what we see is people that end up with oxygen-only systems end up really bored with them within a couple of weeks. Okay, they do get a benefit or an advantage, but, the principle here is they get about half or a third the results that we get with the adaptive contrast. But what Per is saying in terms of the switching back and forth, creating the challenge and the hunger really enables the oxygen to have more effect when you switch back, for it. And, for people that are considering EWOT or oxygen only training systems, the point is your body gets bored really fast and you saturate. And then the other thing, and I'll ask Per to comment on this, is that, we've tried many times to use oxygen-only systems to implement our brain protocol. And without the ability to starve the body and the brain, we can't really establish the blood flow circuit to the brain. We need the hypoxia, low oxygen air to create the challenge, which forces or compels the body into that circuit. Per, if you would please comment on that.
I agree. There's a big difference that I physically feel when I'm using any of these three systems. And at the end of the day, the human body has to have some challenge placed on it in order for it to respond. So if you're just using EWOT, even hyperbaric, you sleep or you don't really do anything. So that it's I think that's its inherent limitation. Like I almost do push-ups. I have a friend who has a 2-person hard-sided hyperbaric, and I've considered doing push-ups in there trying to have a heart rate, like trying to have some sort of upregulation. So to me, the idea is I have to challenge my body in some way to get a different physical response, right? So how I'm sitting right now is not how I'm going to heal myself. So if I just took my oxygen concentrator and started breathing 8% oxygen, it might help me slightly, but not very much. So I have to challenge my body in some way. One is exercise, but exercise is reducing the oxygen you have available. So if you exercise and breathe less oxygen, you've placed your body under a challenge, which your body then can respond to. So it responds by trying to say, I need all the oxygen I possibly can get. Well, then I switch and I give it 80% oxygen. So I get this big change, and you can feel it. Once you get used to exercise, and maybe you haven't exercised, it takes you a month or two. Once you do it, you breathe a couple breaths of oxygen, you actually feel the difference in your body, and you get in this, I have to like burn it off. I don't know what the medical term is, but when I'm switching between the two, there's this 20 or 30 seconds where it feels like I'm not exercising. It's like almost so easy. I have to burn that off before I feel like I'm challenging my body again.
I'm sharing a brain oxygen use graph during a LiveO2 workout. And I'm going to ask you to comment on this because we've got a presentation. But basically, at time zero, and again, this would be your experience. At time zero, we got a baseline. Okay. And this goes through a series of oxygen reduced exertions or sprints and then recovery cycles. The recoveries are about 15 seconds, just like you mentioned. But if you'll notice, the important point about the graph is you start out at a baseline, which is the normal amount of energy / oxygen the brain is using and creating energy. By the time you finish, in this example, there's a 29% increase in the brain energy production, which happens to be true. Yes, we're just measuring the brain, but this energy production capacity is body-wide. Okay, given your point, I've said this and people look and they listen to us. It's like, you guys are nuts. There's no way you can do this until you measure it. So, given your near decade of experience, is this graph consistent with your experience with the product?
It is. And I'll say this. So that's just my personal experience. I've also spent 10 plus years researching oxygen. So I'm not the medical doctor. I can out-argue most of them when it comes to oxygen. I've studied Manfred von Erden's multi-step oxygen therapy. I know you've also looked at his research. So I've studied the CTE work here in town that's going in Boston with the head trauma work. And at the end of the day, the fastest way to damage a brain cell is to deny it oxygen. I argue that the fastest way to repair it is to give it more. And when you look at oxygen impact on the brain, it's absolutely proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that when you increase the oxygen, it increases brain health. And if this is my whole thing, being in hyperbaric is helpful. However, you're not doing anything. So if I can have the same benefit, but I can be exercising, and I do adaptive contrast, then the brain energy and the amount of oxygen your brain has goes up dramatically. And it's noticeable both from your own personal experience and I believe all the science outside of what you're doing, all other science backs it up and agrees with what you're saying.
Okay, well, now let's go back into the oxygen only. So again, I'm being a little speculative, but one of the things that happens in this chart is if you take a look at this from a chart point of view, you'll notice that as I proceed through the 18-minute workout, you have a series of higher highs and higher lows, and the general trend is upward. And my assertion is, and with respect to this image, is that if you were just dealing with oxygen only within what they call EWOT, that you would not be able to exit with as dramatic of an increase in brain energy. Okay, again, I'm just looking for experiential, or do you have any experiences?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yes, because your body very quickly plateaus. So part of what brought me to oxygen and to LiveO2 was I used to do free diving. So free diving is holding your breath for a couple minutes and swimming around underwater. To be able to do that, you have to understand yourself and you have to change your physiological state. If I sat here right now and hold my breath, I'd hold my breath for a minute. Earlier this year, I have on my phone, I did 4 minutes and 32 seconds. So the way I can do that is because I was doing breathing work every day and I was getting my body to change its physiological state. So when I came into this, I already had experience in understanding what that felt like. And my brain can function after 4 minutes of holding my breath, just like it does right now. And so there's a feeling I have and an understanding I have of my own body, how it interacts with oxygen, that mirrors this. So when I started doing LiveO2, I started to feel like I had when I was in training for freediving, where I'm like, okay, my brain is now functioning. I can actually have higher brain function even when breathing less. That makes sense. And that's a internal response. All freedivers have it. You have to train yourself to do it. And so what you're showing me here exactly mirrors it, because I can have high brain function breathing not at all. Then obviously if I breathe more oxygen, I can have a higher brain energy, which to me is what your graph is showing.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. So let's go a little bit longitudinal as in long time. So, again, over 10 years, I don't know how old you are, but do you feel like over the past decade you've become physically stronger and that LiveO2 has served you as an athletic training platform, or how well can you parameterize that for us?
I will, but I'm going to speak to the opposite because it's where I started. So when I first came out to train with you, part of what I told you was I said, if I start to exercise for like 6 or 8 minutes, light jogging, internally, I feel like I'm in danger and I should stop. So I said, I'm going to come out here. I said, it's been like 8 years that I have not been able to jog around the block. And I said, I'm going to try your machine and we'll figure out what you think and we'll figure out how I feel. So I started from a point of, even though I was not overweight, if you looked at me and my athletic ability, you would have thought like, I had terrible sleep apnea. I was terribly obese and like out of bed. So I started from that point, and then when you use your machine for the first time, it was like 15 minutes the first 2 days, and I can remember telling you, wow, I feel that's better than I thought I could feel. And so my first message and thought for people is the first advantage of additional oxygen is that it enables you to exercise and you feel better. So if you right now you can't walk around the block or you can't exercise, you can do it for 6 or 8 minutes and stop. If you had oxygen, you can do it for like 15 minutes and feel better. So the first thing is, and you can do this with EWOT. The first thing is having additional oxygen when you're exercising, you just physically, internally feel better, feel safer in a way, right? It just feels a little safer when you're doing it, when you haven't exercised. So that's the first thing, is it helps you in the first month or two. It just helps you move, exercise. Now you get up to 20 minutes. Now you can walk around the block okay, right? And then your body will quickly plateau. So this is the part that all science backs this up, is that the body has to be challenged constantly. Even resilience has to be challenged constantly to maintain your emotional resilience. So this is where the adaptive contrast, as you call it, comes in. Because as soon as I do oxygen only for a month, my body plateaus and I feel fine for 20 minutes. To gain improvement, I have to challenge my body. Now, there's two ways you really can do it. You can sprint on the bike, which to this day, as athletic as I am, I don't enjoy sprinting because it physically hurts. Or you can reduce the oxygen you're breathing and stay at the same energy level, same effort level. So I prefer the adaptive contrast because I just switch to low oxygen. I maintain the 60, 65% energy effort level. I go hypoxic, I switch. Now I've challenged my body enough that when I breathe the oxygen, it works.
Okay, so when you started, you started out from a status of debilitating fatigue, and I think in our pre-discussion you said you're holding an hour or a very long time, during training now. So parameterize that.
When I'm doing the LiveO2, which is 45 seconds at low oxygen, and then I do 3 breaths of enriched oxygen and then go back. So I just broke my bike, but I got up to about 32 minutes. I started that earlier in the year. I had the C word, not being cancer, the other C word that has come around. And that brought back the same debilitating situation. What I had is exactly what long C word is. When you look at those two, it's medically what it was. So it brought back the symptoms. And I started at like 12 minutes when I started doing your brain flush. And then I got up to about 32 minutes. If I'm just riding the bike at about 60, 65% effort, I can do like 2 hours. So I went from a place where I couldn't walk around the block 10 years ago to I'm physically healthier than most people my age. And this is recovering from a condition which has no treatment. So if anything, I hope it's encouraging to people that if you have chronic fatigue is the generic name, even though that's not a medical term, you can recover. You absolutely can recover. And the one way to exercise recover is to give yourself oxygen. So chronic fatigue is you go in exercise debt. They call it exercise intolerance. So if you exercise today, you can't get out of bed tomorrow. Well, that's also partly dependent upon the energy your body had when you exercised. Mm-hmm. So you can increase the glucose, which is hard to do, or you increase the oxygen, which is easy to do. So if you have a chronic fatigue situation and you're exercise intolerant, breathe oxygen while you're exercising. And you'll notice that you feel drastically better the next day. So 15 minutes makes you, a third in debt the next day. You'll feel drastically better. And then once you build up a little tolerance, you can start doing adaptive contrast, challenge your body, and you can recover. Chronic fatigue is not a permanent condition. It's a collection of symptoms. And if you reduce those symptoms, by definition, you don't have the disorder anymore.
Well, one of the things that, we've got on our website, it's under fatigue, letter O, digit 2, is an explanation, physiological explanation, where the aggregation of vascular obstruction prevents oxygen or blocks oxygen from getting to the cells. And the main thing that Dr. Manfred von Ardenne documented is the forcing of the blood to the distal end of the capillaries basically enables the oxygen to work like Drano and restore blood flow. Just had a conversation with somebody earlier this morning. He says, well, how's this going to cure my fatigue? And I directed them to our Fatigue O2 page, and where I go through the, functional explanation. And, once the fatigue phenomenon continues for a period of time, you end up with other conditions. You end up with pain syndromes as a result of this chronic hypoxia, where you get acids and bad chemistry accumulating in. You're sore all the time, and all of this stuff is a direct result of oxygen delivery compromise. And that's the main thing that LiveO2 does, is it restores the oxygen delivery. And so, back to PEAR, the principle here is that, LiveO2 is not a temporary solution. It tends to be a permanent solution and puts you in a position where you can not only overcome your challenge, but maintain your quality of life,
Yes.
in spite of additional challenges that come your way. So, Per, if you comment on that.
Yes. So the science of cold training mirrors what you just said about how much blood flow you have. So I cold train every day. So this morning it was 23 degrees and windy, and I walked around wearing shorts and gloves, no shirt. So the reason why I do that is because I'm allowing my body to cool off, which puts the majority of the blood to my core. When I come back inside and I warm up, the majority of blood goes to my exterior. So the only way to exercise your capillaries are through, that I know of two ways. One is cold training. And in the summer, it's hard to do because you have to go find like a restaurant depot with a refrigerator and go stand in it for an hour. So you can technically cold train in the summer, but it's not easy. The other thing to do is to deny yourself oxygen and challenge your body, because it creates a cardiovascular response, which pushes the maximum amount of blood through your capillaries that you possibly can. So I think those are the only two ways I know of that you can fully exercise your capillaries and your total cardiovascular system is cold training. And I don't know if you do cold plunges or not. I have a neighbor up the street who I ran into the other day. She asked me why I walk around no shirt. I told her, she goes, "Oh, I do cold tubs. That's just easier." I've not done a cold tub yet, but you can do cold tubs or you can do an adaptive contrast style oxygen treatment.
We went hardcore on the cold plunge thing. We have a IBC tote beside the hot tub outside, and we live at about 7,500 feet. So we added 40 pounds of salt to our IBC tote, which is full of cold water. So now 32 degrees is not cold enough. So we're out there with a chainsaw on New Year's Day, cutting off the 7 inches of ice, mixing in salt to get proper. So at present, Tanner has the family record of sitting in the cold tub at 6 minutes and 6 seconds. And we have a little trophy that is owned by one of us, whoever has the house record for the cold tub plunge. And I used to have it for a while. I was at 5 minutes and a half until my wife freaked out thinking I was frozen to death and the brain chill would kill me.
I have all respect for that. My cousin is in Ithaca, New York, going through a divorce and needed to get in grips with himself. So he is swimming until there's ice on the lake. So once or twice a week, he sends me a photograph and he goes, it's him dunking his face in whatever's lake. All respect. But in all seriousness, Mark, those are the only two ways I know of to fully exercise cardiovascularly, because I can go run around, but that's actually not doing that. That's very specific in how my body is moving blood. 80% of the effort is regulating temperature.
Right.
It's not actually trying to exercise your capillaries or get maximum blood flow. So the only way I know to do it is to cold train and then warm back up, or challenge your body with a lack of oxygen.
Right. All right. So this is our FatiGO2 page. And Per, you're kind of our poster child for this protocol. You just go to LiveO2, drop under, and look down at the exhaustion. And so we go through the nature of fatigue. And then the condition I was trying to remember before is called fibromyalgia, whereas if the muscles stay sufficiently hypoxic for a long time, then you end up with structural defects in the neurological tissue, et cetera. So, for anybody that's looking at fatigue and overcoming fatigue, this page on our site is a pretty good starting point for understanding the role of oxygen in remediating and, in Per's case, durable resolution to the problem or the issue. All right.
That is, Mark, the issue in all of this is it durable? And I have the question on a regular basis. I go talk to doctors today, and the whole question is, what's the durability? And at the end of the day, the durability I need is my body healing itself. So I don't need external solutions, because that's not really durable. It's almost always treating a symptom. So for people who have any sort of chronic illness or disorder, the question you have is, how do you heal yourself? And I came to the fastest way to kill a cell is actually electricity, but most of the time we don't do that to ourselves. Naturally, it's oxygen. So I always focus back on that is I have to give my body more oxygen first, and then secondarily more, glucose, ATP production. So I always start at oxygen because that is where the body starts. And I'm amazed how few medical professionals actually understand that. And I just had a neurologist appointment this week, and I didn't even get into it because I could have out-argued this guy on oxygen. And it's unfortunate. But if you have a chronic illness, I would encourage you to look at oxygen being where you start the recovery, because that's an internal fix. And when you internally fix the body, the symptoms are lessened or go away.
Well, let me redefine this. So if you use the word fatigue or exhaustion in a sentence, okay, the literal cause of exhaustion is your body isn't making enough energy to enable you to operate normally. Okay, and there are two basic substrates to energy production, which is oxygen and glucose, or fuel. And your body makes energy by combining the fuel and the oxygen. Yep. Okay. And if anything interferes with the presence or sufficiency of those at the cellular level, then you're going to be tired or fatigued. Okay. But when you go take a look at the medical model, a doctor will never ask the question. They will put a pulse oximeter on your finger and say, wow, you've got plenty of oxygen. But the oxygen in the blood does not equal oxygen in the cell. And the thing that LiveO2, yes, particularly with the adaptive contrast, is it's handling or optimizing and in most cases restoring that last leg of the journey from the cell to the oxygen, which is exactly what Dr. Rowan is talking about in the fatigue presentation here. Because yes, it's just like passive oxygen. You put a mask on and breathe oxygen. Well, that puts oxygen in the lungs, but it does nothing to move it from the lungs to the tip of your finger or your toe or your brain or any other part of the body. Yep. Okay. And that's where the, oxygen with exercise, well, the exercise part moves it further, but the oxygen plus the exercise plus the adaptive contrast that really challenges the vascular system to move the blood is what gets it from here to everywhere else better than any other known method. So, all right, and I'll give you an example, like in that graph I showed you, people that do that particular protocol with the adaptive contrast, if you give them an IQ test, they will normally score between 5 and 15% higher at the end of the workout because their brain has enough oxygen available to make energy. Therefore, that organ works better. And that's true for every muscle, every organ, the heart, the lungs, the liver, the kidneys throughout the body. So anyway, I'm going to go back and I'll get you to comment on this. It's like, when you exit your LiveO2, it's like, man, I feel good. I'm not tired. So have you ever been tired after a LiveO2 workout?
No. Mark, I want to go to something you just said because Manfred von Ardenne directly speaks to it. So I just yesterday had a pulse ox on my finger and they said, oh, it's 100%. But Manfred von Ardenne's point is that doesn't mean that every part of your body has 100% oxygen. To your point, that's only blood flow. It's not in the cells. But his research pointed out that, like head injuries, for example, when you have an injury and there's inflammation, you have restricted blood flow. So just because you have enough blood in your finger doesn't mean an injured part of your body has enough blood flow. So the key part of hyperbaric and adaptive contrast with you is that it increases the amount of dissolved oxygen that's in the plasma. And Manfred von Ardenne's research proved that that's the healing benefit. So when somebody has a head injury and they go into hyperbaric, which is off-label, we'll note, what's healing is that the increased pressure dissolves more oxygen in the plasma, and that plasma oxygen is the healing benefit. So you can sit in hyperbaric or sit in a doctor's chair and have 100% oxygen in your finger, but that doesn't actually mean the oxygen is healing your body. And when you increase the dissolved plasma oxygen, his research proves that that heals the body. To your point, that means the cell can actually get more oxygen, therefore produce more ATP/energy.
Right. And so, the amount of oxygen the cell gets is the amount of the oxygen the cell can use. And therefore the energy budget of the cell is, limited by generally either how many mitochondria are in the cell, which kind of gets addressed by your training pattern, or any anything that limits either the fuel or the oxygen. And it's usually the oxygen that is the rate limiting phenomenon or the rate limiting element in the energy production process. So when you fix oxygen system wide, you increase the oxygen production to the next highest or the next lowest rate limiting phenomenon.
Mark, the rate limiting is interesting because the start of all disease is inflammation. Inflammation inherently limits the oxygen and glucose that can get to a cell. So what you're saying is directly connects to how the illness cycle happens. When I reduce, when I have inflammation, I reduce blood flow. I reduce blood flow, I've reduced energy. That cell cannot function at its best. I can remember I was an athlete in the 80s, 90s, and they were translating Soviet training documents. And the only thing I remember was it was translated and it said, post-exercise, they give a vigorous massage. I was like, I don't know what that actually means in the Soviet Union, but I bet it's painful. But what they now do this all, we all do it now, but the Soviets figured out that post-exercise, you don't stretch beforehand. Afterwards, you give a rigorous massage. And what's that doing is forcing out waste so that you have proper blood flow. So the whole point of that is to have the correct amount of blood flow. So instead of, waste products building up and reducing the blood flow, causing soreness, if you massage it out, then you have proper blood flow, proper oxygen, glucose, and you're not as sore the next day.
Well, actually, I have another document that I'll share with you that kind of goes into this, which is we have a document on our site called Training Resolution Patterns. So, like, for example, a lot of people, sometimes they'll use 2 pulse oximeters on their fingers. And then for people, a lot of times they'll see a different pulse oximetry reading on their left hand versus their right, especially for first-time beginners. Okay, and so what we literally observe is that a part of the body that's injured will suck more oxygen out of the blood on that side of the body. Okay, so, and that's one of the things that people don't understand is that it is very typical for people to have unknown blockages or losses of oxygen to parts of their body. And this is particularly true in the fatigue pattern. So anyway, so a lot of times people will get on LiveO2, they'll show stereo 99s, then they'll start to work out just on oxygen, and their PO2 on one side or the other, or possibly both, will plummet as their body's repaying the oxygen debt. So back to the relevance of this in your story, in the beginning, I don't remember because it was a long time ago, I think we saw this with you. So when you started to work out, your PO2 plummeted, if memory serves, down in the 70s while we were just beginning with you. Do you remember that?
I don't remember the number. I remember it happening. Yeah, I don't remember the number. I do want to touch on this. Here's what I do remember. So I showed up feeling like 6 or 8 minutes exercise was a little dangerous. And by the end of the second week, it was 55. I did 55 minutes on your bike the end of the second week. And that's where I was like, I need to buy these things because I'm like, I don't know what just happened. I was in disbelief. I still have trouble comprehending like what happened in those 2 weeks because I'd gone from like 8 years of being trouble getting. I went from like free diving and weightlifting to not being able to get out of bed, and have no answer, no explanation of any kind. And then I show up at your place, and I'm like, I'm at like 6,000 feet, walking through the airport in my bag, walking slower at the airport. And then all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, I was doing like an hour. I did 55 minutes on your bike. I remember it was like a Friday. It was like a thing for me. I was like, I just did 55 minutes and felt fine, felt great. I did the ozone far infrared sauna afterwards. Mm-hmm. And I could not believe how well I felt.
And again, so for somebody listening, and again, for all of those with, fatigue related issues, this is, actually PEAR was when we first discovered this fatigue remediation, and we understand the physiology a lot better now, but we've done this probably hundreds of times since PEAR, not necessarily us doing it. The process is simple enough that they can do it for themselves. And once you do it for themselves, if you have the equipment, you can do it for you anytime you want, as well as when somebody comes into your world that you'd like to help, then you've got the ability to help them. So, Per, tell us this, have you been able to, help other people with your system?
I have, and it's like the second machine I had, a doctor friend of mine wanted to use in his office. So he actually used it with sprinters. If you're an athlete, I'll touch on this for a second. If you're an athlete and you build up lactic acid, you can do the vigorous Soviet massage, which is useful. What you also can do is 2 to 3 sprints where you sprint enough to generate a heart rate, hypoxic, and then switch and breathe live in 80% oxygen. And you'll very quickly train yourself that after 2 or 3 of these, you'll have a lactic acid purge, and because you sprint to the bathroom. So he's using a lot of sprinters because it allows them to purge out lactic acid. You have a massage, then you get on the bike, you do 2 or 3 of these. And I've never figured out the science on why it happens. You might know.
Yeah, I'll go through that. When we first discovered this, I was working with some football players from the Cleveland Browns, and they've since retired. But the fun part was, I was like, we didn't really understand this, and I just developed the adaptive contrast feature. So anyway, went over and was training them, and I'd be talking to them. They had what I call season fatigue because they were so loaded up with, I'll call it blood gunk, like lactic acid, etc., that their oxygen to the brain was limited, and that you'd be talking to them, they'd be falling asleep in front of you. And then, by mid-season, I called it season fatigue, and they'd be sore every place and just tired. So, and when I started training them on LiveO2, it's like, train them, they'd be sitting in the chair squirming. I was like, then they'd have to go to the bathroom. Yeah. And I started calling that the LiveO2 quick step. And, anyway, so the same group or a different group from St. Louis came to Denver to play the Broncos and managed to spank the Broncos. It's probably all my fault. But the point was that they were season fatigued. And anyway, I said, now, by the way, you guys, you don't want to be trusting any farts for the next hour, because what happens is, they've got all this lactic acid, built up in the tissue. And when the oxygen hits the tissue, it opens up and all that lactic acid washes out. Okay, but because they weigh 250, 300 pounds, when all that lactic acid hits the liver, it overwhelms the Krebs cycle, and the liver can't recycle it. So it will dump the surplus of lactic acid into the gallbladder, which subsequently dumps into the gut. When that product or waste product hits the gut, it fast tracks out the back door.
I think there's actually an element to the fatigue where when you can't exercise, you don't have enough oxygen, your body's not functioning, you do build up in your body unnatural contaminants. And exercising, LiveO2, oxygen, et cetera, I think brings you to a point where you can purge it.
Yeah, I would suggest there's a couple of different phenomena occurring. So you've got I'll call it the lactic carriers, which is the large people. But I think in your case, we were looking at probably a couple of different phenomena. And I absolutely agree that you had residual toxicity where the cells were unable to pump out because they didn't have the energy capacity, which was part of the fatigue. But then another thing that I think was going on in that situation is that a lot of people will, if they're in a fatigue, then what happens is not only are they physically fatigued, but their immune system lacks the resources to act effectively. Okay, so sometimes with early users, they'll have what we call an immune rally, meaning that they'll, increase the oxygen level, and then the immune system will get the energy or the substrates required to make energy, so the immune system will go active. And it's fairly. Did you happen to have a fever when that went on? Do you remember feeling like cold?
No.
Right, well, that's another phenomenon. So
GI.
Okay, GI. Okay, so that was probably detox, where you might have had, deeper dumping from the liver. But just for the listener, it is common, or not common, but for people that have had stealth infections and stuff like that, it's like at 24 to 48 hours after their LiveO2 session, they'll end up with a nominal fever of 101 or something like that. They'll feel like feverish and exhausted from the immune rally for 24 hours. And then after that 24 hours, they'll say, wow, I haven't felt this good in 20 years.
There's actually, Mark, a lot of science to that with chronic fatigue, exercise intolerance, systemic exercise intolerance disorder, in that if you never have a cold, you never have the flu, that's actually not health.
Mm-hmm.
It means your immune system is so depleted it can't respond. So there's science to what you just said. And so if somebody uses oxygen, AdaptiveContrast, LiveO2, and it energizes their body and it improves their immune system, they'll often have an illness response because their immune system is now strong enough to respond appropriately.
Correct.
And that's where I think a lot of people are in a stasis that they don't realize.
Well, one of the other things, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to displace, but for the audience, one of the things that you don't realize is, quote unquote, having an infection. Infections themselves have no symptoms. The bugs move into the cells and mess with the cells. Okay, you only get or feel sick when the immune system goes active and starts killing off the cells and making a mess and creating this requirement for detoxification. So the actual process of feeling ill, having a fever, feeling fatigued because you're sick is because your immune system is drawing energy away from your core metabolism. Okay, so there's different states of sickness. Okay, so the worst state is, you're fatigued and your immune system doesn't have the resources to, overcome an invader. The second level is, okay, you're in a decent energy shape, you're doing your work, but when your immune system kicks on, you don't have the resources to feel good and run your immune system. And then, like with LiveO2, and we've got research to that effect, is that when you have so much energy, your immune system can kick on and you still feel fine and get rid of what's going on. You'll notice, like, well, I can't work out quite as hard as I would yesterday, so I call those soft training days. And, now with this, most of our customers have soft training days as opposed to becoming actually ill because they've got a sufficient energy surplus to do their day and run their immune system.
If there is a person watching this who has chronic fatigue, the medical definition is systemic exercise intolerance disease. That's the official medical term. If somebody has that, please understand that is a collection of symptoms. It is actually a disorder, not actually disease. I'm not sure why they use disease on the end. It's actually a disorder because it's a differential diagnosis, meaning there's 20 symptoms, and if you have 12 of them, you have it. So the reason why I want to bring this up is it's possible for you to diminish those symptoms and recover. It's entirely possible. There's no known treatment, partly because there's no known exact cause. So there could be 20 causes of your symptoms. So I cannot emphasize to you enough. I spent 6 or 8 years not able to function as a person, and I recovered healthier now than most people my age. So if you have chronic fatigue, SCID, there is hope and you can recover. There's many key treatments I've used. One of them is oxygen. So I do hyperbaric. I do LiveO2. So I think oxygen is a key part of the recovery from chronic fatigue. And please, if you're watching, research, educate yourself, because you have to be your own doctor. But if you do that, you can recover and you can get better.
Well, one of the things that I'll also need to add here, because of what you just said, is, LiveO2 is an exercise/training platform. It is not intended to treat, cure anything. It is just enabled or intended to help you have better energy production. And a lot of times that better energy production will remediate the tendency of having symptoms of fatigue-related syndromes.
It's almost every illness we have is energy-based. Right? Almost every illness we have reduces our cells and our body's ability to generate energy. So I'm an enormous believer in we focus on that point of view rather than say, well, I have a headache, I'm trying to diminish the headache. Let's flip the point of view and say, ultimately, I'm trying to generate more energy within my brain. Because coming from that point of view is fundamentally more effective than coming from, I'm going to treat a symptom and hope the cause goes away on its own. Mark, let's touch on cost. So okay. I want to touch on cost because you're not cheap and you're not free, right? So there is this is a cost, and it's a significant question. My point of view when it comes to having a LiveO2 machine and now needing to get a new one is, what is the cost of me not being healthy? And I mean all of that cost, not just dollar cost, right? So there's a negative cost that I bear not being healthy. And when I look at that and I say, I'm going to project this over the next 5 or 10 years, like, what does that look like? It's a mountain. So although LiveO2 is not cheap and it costs some money, when I look at the dollar cost versus the cost of being ill, the ROI is worth it. So when you look at it, I'd be very surprised if, I'm not sure if you've ever had a return on a unit. I'd be very surprised if anybody buys it, uses it for a couple of weeks, and is willing even to the thought of not using it anymore. I'd be surprised. I don't know what your return rate is, but I bet it's very low.
It's very low. Normally, I mean, there's some people that have different pathologies that, doesn't resolve. But, the principle here is most people end up saying they'll give up their LiveO2 if you pry it out of their cold dead hands.
Yeah.
And so, but this interesting point, and you kind of hit the nail, or, focused on a really good point. So is this a good investment? And I don't know, pull a number out, but if you use the return on investment metric, can you express your personal return on investment for your LiveO2 and experience?
So I bought 2 of them and I've had them for 10 years. I mean, I don't know, if I were to amortize that as like $1 a treatment, no, it'd have to be less. I don't know.
Probably
it's so low. It might be a couple bucks. So like if I look at a couple bucks a treatment and it's direct benefit to me versus all the other money I spend in the medical industry, like it's the cheapest thing I do, but it's probably also one of the best things I do. So the like cost benefit analysis is that if you look at the per treatment cost, it's very low. Multiple people can use it. So everybody has older family members who benefit from using it. So numerous people can use it. You have it forever. I mean, mine ran for 9.5 years before the little switch broke. So it's incredibly durable. I don't know how you built the unit, but that thing is run out there. That generator has sat out there. I don't know how many thousands of hours on the little clicker. But I mean, the thing's just sat out there and ran forever. And it's still running. If I only want to do EWOT, I just leave it on the high oxygen and keep using the same machine. But I want to upgrade so I can do your adaptive contrast again.
Well, let me go back to my basic conversation, which is when I take a look at the personal yield or personal return on investment, the fact is I feel good most of the time. And when I sit at my desk and I'm trying to, be effective as a CEO and trying to guide people and stuff like that, having this organ at the top, above my eyes working properly makes a huge difference in my revenue and earning potential and my ability to run a company. And so, to me, and again, this is just, vested interest speaking, if I didn't have the product, I don't think I'd be near as effective, and I certainly wouldn't be in as good a shape and feel as good as I do. And so that whole feeling good enables me to be a lot more effective as a business owner operator. And I get the same feedback from plumbers, electricians, tradesmen, and everybody. So what's your feedback there?
Well, I think it's like, I think part of your answer is actually the fact that what do we consider to be health? And we've been kind of numbed into this believing in America that like this inevitable, it happens, everybody like ages like this. And that's just the way life is. And I think that A is a lie. And B, you can do something about it. And one of the easiest things you can do about it is to exercise and give yourself more oxygen. So to me, the point of view is you have to, if you just want to be like everybody else and age like everybody else, fine, go for it. Like if that's what you want. If you want to be at your best and you want to realize you can actually have more energy, you can think better, you can have a better memory, and you can do it for yourself, and you can do it every day, then you need something that you can do for yourself every day. And so to me, LiveO2, I obviously am not an owner of the company. I don't get anything from this. I've been a customer and that's it. I believe it is one of the keys to pushing off aging, restoring your energy, recovering from accidents and illness. I mean, I'm sure you've done this. I'm sure you've noticed this, that like you have the flu, like day 2 or day 3, you go jump on your machine right? Breathe oxygen for, an hour or two, do it the next day. And then like day 5, you don't even know you had it. Like your body has to go through a bit of this. But as soon as you get through I don't know what you call it. Like there's an inflection point. The moment you get past the inflection point, you go get on your machine and like 24 hours later, you feel great.
As soon as I feel something coming on, I'm on the machine. As soon as my foot hits the ground getting off, I feel much better.
You feel better, yeah.
Yeah, and there's actually science behind that.
Almost all illness reduces our body's ability to onboard and use oxygen. Mm-hmm. So when you go in the hospital, you can have almost any illness. When they do your PPO, either in the blood or on your finger, it's always depleted. So like when you feel bad, I'm sure there's studies on this, like the fatigue you feel and how much, like from a fever or something, and how much the flu, how much that is related to oxygen. Because if you have like a 10% reduction in your oxygen capacity, you have like a 40% decrease in your energy production. It's not a linear function. So if you have an illness, you go get on the machine, you breathe oxygen. Even if you don't exercise, just breathing oxygen, you'd feel better.
No, that's absolutely true. And if you go into our oxygen library, we actually have data energy production graphs of having cold and flu. So a lot of people model cold and flu as a quote unquote virus affecting the lungs, but we model it as a functional injury to the lungs where the mucus effectively blocks gas transfer. And so when you get a cold or a flu, if you block the gas transfer in the lungs, number one, you've got more CO2 stuck on the red blood cells and your oxygen absorption. So like a 10% loss or 7% loss in PO2 saturation is actually equates to a 50% loss in your body's ability to make energy. So when you get hit with the cold or a flu, you feel like crap. Okay, but that's because your body's ability to make energy is reduced. So, and this article that I'll bring up momentarily as soon as it comes up is that when you restore your body's ability to make energy, you still know you're sick, you're still bad affected, but you feel much, much better. And the other thing that happens that this document, and even Manfred von Arden, documented, here it is. So there's another article on our website that talks about the biomechanics of having a cold or a flu. This is before the COVID thing came along, but it's a similar kind of phenomenon, which is, it modeling the cold or flu as a lung injury that inhibits gas transfer. So when you get and use LiveO2, as soon as you get sick, it generally restores the oxygenation process. So you feel better. And because your immune system has the energy to do the work it needs to do to clean up the mess, your period of being sick collapses from weeks to a much shorter period of time. And in my experience, normally 2 to 3 days. I mean,
Mark,
go ahead.
I want to speak to what you just said with more specificity. So you said that an infection, a cold or flu, is an injury that reduces our body's ability to create energy. Mm-hmm. To be more specific, it reduces our lungs' ability to absorb oxygen, which means that our body has less oxygen available to it to then convert into energy. Mm-hmm. And then it also reduces your body's ability to off-gas CO2.
Correct.
Which it's like 5 times stickier than oxygen molecules, like in your blood. So it's again not a linear function. If you have a 10% increase in CO2, it's a very big increase in the debt it causes or the limitation it creates for the oxygen capacity.
Exactly. So, and I think this is a very important point, which is whether it's COVID or the cold or flu, virtually any disease, particularly respiratory diseases, represent a loss in the ability to move oxygen within the body and to dump CO2. Therefore, a big percentage of the symptoms and what makes them even serious in the first place is the fact that, it can reduce oxygen transport below a critical level. And so, what we found in our experience is that even most pain, post-surgery, et cetera, is actually due to an absence or a loss of oxygenation due to, trauma to the vascular system. And it is possible even to remediate that pain by restoring oxygen delivery, which gets off into another branch. But, The point here is like, oh, I got a cold or, a virus. And the issue is no, what you have is the loss of oxygen delivery because something has adversely affected your body's ability to move oxygen. And if you overcome or restore the oxygen transport capability, a lot of the reason, you'll feel much better and you'll be able to continue to perform. And so, back to your decade-long history, one of the reasons that you have, restored quality of life, if not superior, I believe is that, using LiveO2 like you do has maintained your oxygen capacity daily at a higher level than that would have been before. And that comes to you, or you experience that as a better quality of life every day of your life.
Yes. There's it enables me to recover and restore in a way that's significantly faster, so that I don't notice that I have the problem. Right. So I'm recovering from a flu, for example, faster. I'm recovering from exercise faster. My brain has more energy. So in some ways, I've reached a point where I don't have enough symptoms to be able to understand the benefit as much, right? Because I've reached a high enough energy state that I'm maintaining that state all the time. I just had before December, had some sort of chest infection for 3 days. And it was interesting because I'm afterwards, I was I'm somewhat glad I had it, because you're in a constant state, then you go down. When I came back to the state I was 4 days before, I felt awesome because I had a contrast. Mm-hmm. I was man alive, I feel good, because I spent 3 days not feeling good. The contrast of coming back to normal was a net positive.